Simple as a pencil is. Somebody's got to go into the ground to extract the iron ore. Somebody's got to smelt it into a form of metal that can be used. You've got loggers in one country, you've got ingredients in multiple countries, which means you need ship captains and a shipping industry and navigational systems, and therefore a GPS. And yes, a pencil is rocket science. When you put all those things together, it is actually very complicated to put together a pencil. And you would expect, based on that, ingredients from 6 different countries, multiple know-hows. Pencil's got to cost at least, what, $200, $300, $400? And yet, how many of you have thought to yourself, I can't wait to graduate from college because I will be able to buy my own pencil? Ludicrous. How do we have this? Well, then the next explanation is, if you've got so many ingredients from so many different countries and it's hard to make and yet it's cheap, surely there's somebody in charge. Like, there's got to be a United Nations Bureau of Pencil Making. I shouldn't say that out loud, somebody's going to get that idea. And yet, no. Pencils are cheap and nobody's in charge. Nobody is in charge of putting together pencils. What happens? The market brings all these people together. The market offers cooperation amongst people who have never met. The market offers incentives for people to serve each other in putting this product together, and it communicates the limited knowledge that people don't have. The market, through the price mechanism, puts all this together. So I recommend that you read iPencil in much more eloquent terms. Okay, I promised a little bit of theory. You're not going to get very much. Okay, demand curves slope downward. So insightful that most economists seem to have forgotten this. Just remember, as the price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. I told you I wasn't going to be buying you any new furniture. I'm just going to offer you a rearrangement thereof. Second thing, I've already talked about this in terms of the dynamics of intervention. Other things held constant. When the demand goes up, the equilibrium price and quantity both go up. So we have a combination of things. Incentives are going to matter. And we're going to see that the monetary policy in the US led to a series of incentive changes. Finally, I want to talk about moral hazard. Moral hazard is simply the notion that if people are protected from the consequences of their actions, they're going to take greater risk. I have here a picture of a Ford Pinto, which was allegedly, in the words of Ralph Nader, unsafe at any speed. If you looked at the gas tank a little too sternly, it would explode. Now, on a more serious basis, some studies seem to indicate that even at low speeds, like 25 miles per hour, a direct hit on the gas tank would cause an explosion. Imagine how you would drive one of those on the highway versus driving a Volvo battle tank with side impact protection system, with airbags, with a car that is designed to crumple around you. Moral hazard, you're protected. In fact, people with anti-lock brakes tend to tailgate more than people who don't have them because they're protected from the consequences of their actions. I invest my retirement in a very boring set of stock funds with maybe a 4 or 5% annual return. Why don't I take all my retirement money to Las Vegas and play it on the roulette wheel? Well, because I'd like to retire someday, and if I could, I would make all that money, then I wouldn't have to do what I'm doing now, and I could stay at home all day and read books and write articles about them and talk to interested, wait, I do that anyway, never mind. But if somebody came up to me and said, Wenzel, cash out your retirement fund, go to Vegas, play it all on any game you want, anything you win, you keep. Anything you lose, we'll reimburse. Well, you better believe I'm going to be on the next plane to Vegas in that case, because I'm protected from the consequences of my actions. Was I irrational? No. I'm simply rationally responding to a bad set of incentives, which is what I'd argue the banking industry was doing. Finally, I want to talk about monetary policy. Chuckles up there, Ben Bernanke, as a reminder to all of you, which you should all know, but again, a little extra piece of furniture. This might be the coffee table in the mental dining room that I'm offering. The Federal Reserve sets the price of money through manipulation of the money supply. Now, in the US, the price of computers is established by the interaction of supply and demand, in other words, market forces. The price of umbrellas, the price of books, the price of telephones is established by the market. The price of clothes, of shoes, of bags, of drinks is established by the market. The price of money is established by a Politburo in Washington, D.C., a Soviet-style, unaccountable Politburo in Washington, D.C. So this is going to lead to all sorts of difficult consequences because the price of money does not reflect the underlying forces of supply and demand. It represents the policy choices of a committee in Washington, D.C., and we'll see what the consequences are for that. So, a little bit of a story. In the late 1980s or so, the Federal Reserve started lowering the price of money, otherwise known as the interest rate, or specifically, technically speaking, you probably remember this from your classes, the target federal funds rate. started lowering the price of money, in large part to help get the country out of the consequences of the savings and loan crisis. You have that paired with a new technology, and we get the dot-com bubble. By late 2000, 2001, the Federal Reserve is worried that the economy is overheating. So it increases the price of money to slow down the economy. It worked. We got a recession in 2001. So then the Federal Reserve says, we're in a recession. Let's lower the interest rates that jumpstart the economy. And it lowered them to about 1%, and the interest rate stayed at about 1% for about 2 years, and then started climbing a little bit. Then the Federal Reserve says, oops, we have what appears to be a housing bubble. Let's raise the interest rates to slow down the economy and burst the housing bubble. And guess what? It did. We got a recession starting in 2007. What did the Federal Reserve do at that point? Let's lower the interest rates. Wait a minute, I'm sensing a pattern here. So there are two ways to look really at the Federal Reserve right now. One way to look at the Federal Reserve is that the Federal Reserve is the heroic agency that has saved us from business cycles. The other way to look at it is the Federal Reserve is the pyromaniac who gets a medal for starting a fire and then being the first person to call the fire department. Because there seems to be a pattern here that whenever the economy is overheating because the Federal Reserve has lowered interest rates, then the Federal Reserve raises the interest rates to burst that bubble, which leads to a recession, so the Federal Reserve lowers the interest rates again to get us started, and of course, people learn from their mistakes, right, which is why, oh wait, no. Because now we have nominal interest rates at about 0.25%. The target rate is 0 to 0.25%. They're currently at about 0.15%. Now, I'll give you my regulatory theory as to why we're not in the beginnings of a bubble quite yet. And that's simply because the banks are sitting on about $1.5 trillion of unlent reserves that they're worried about lending for a variety of regulatory reasons. But we have this up and down cycle. So what does that mean? Well, lower interest rates mean cheaper money. So if the price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. Quantity demanded of what? Loans that you can get with that cheaper money. And then with that, the demand goes up for stuff that you buy with loans, like housing. But then why did it go specifically into housing? Well, I want to share with you an analogy for a few moments before I talk about the regulatory aspects and start wrapping up. My students occasionally forget to study during the entire semester. It happens. They didn't write it down in their notebooks or their BlackBerries, or they forget to study, and then suddenly they realize they've got an exam in a week, and they've got 14 weeks worth, you guys would never do that, 14 weeks worth of material to cram into 1 week. So what do? They start popping coffee, No-Dose, Coke, Mountain Dew, whatever the name is, and then the body gets a signal that it's awake, but eventually what happens? You crash. Second analogy to illustrate this same point, think of my teaching assistant as a leprechaun. Turns out it's an evil leprechaun, and I didn't know this. I grade the first exam, the average is 90%, I hand them back to my teaching assistant to return to the students, and he lies, because he's an evil leprechaun, that's what evil leprechauns do. And he says to all of you that you got 100% on the exam. Now, because you're studying economics, you respond rationally by cutting back your amount of study time. Of course, you maximize on different margins. Well, I noticed the next exam has an average of 70%. So I hand the exam back to the evil leprechaun TA, who returns it to you and lies again. And this way, throughout the semester, the leprechaun always tells you you got 100%, you respond accordingly, everybody fails the class, and you come complain to me and say, what happened? Well, were you irrational in any way? No. You responded rationally to bad information. And what my argument is going to be that entrepreneurs throughout the 2000s responded rationally to the bad information of prices that were set forth by the Federal Reserve. The last analogy you sort of have to hold on to your hats for, but I'm going to give it a whirl because I think it's fun. I borrowed this one from Gene Callahan in his book, Economics for Real People. Imagine that over the summer, to supplement my professor's salary, I drive a bus through a desert. And it's a big desert, it doesn't have gas stations, and so I tell my passengers that they have a choice. We can either get through the desert in about 6 hours at an uncomfortable 85 to 90 degrees because all the gas is going to be going to the speed of the bus, or we can crank the air conditioning and have a nice, pleasant, comfortable ride at 60 degrees, but it's going to take us 12 hours to get through the desert because I don't want to drive too fast and run out of gas if we're using up all that gas on air conditioning. So I instruct the passengers to set their individual thermostats at their seats and tell me what temperature they want.